Benvindo. My name is Katja Guenther, and I'm happy to be joining you all today as part of your learning on ethical dilemmas in veterinary medicine. I'm here today to share with you some of my findings and insights from research that I've conducted in the Los Angeles area in the United States that examines specifically how animal shelters contribute to and reproduce inequalities that exist in society between and also among humans and animals. To provide you with a sense of where we'll be heading today, I'll start with a quick overview of what I plan to share with you. I'll start out with a brief introduction of myself, and as part of that, I think inevitably we'll also share some information about animal sheltering more generally in the United States, as there are certainly some clear and notable differences that I think you especially will be aware of between the US context and that in Brazil. I'll then spend the bulk of the conversation focused on some of the different ways in which animal shelters reproduce social inequalities. And finally, I'll conclude by sharing with you some ideas and suggestions that you in your careers as veterinarians can take on, to think about or to act on, so that you can try to improve outcomes for people and animals going forward in ways that hopefully don't continue this pattern of replicating social inequalities present in Brazilian culture and society. In terms of my background, I have a PhD in sociology, and I'm currently a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California in Riverside, which is about 50 miles east of the city of Los Angeles. I conducted field work as part of the last 7 or 8 years, or maybe even 9 years at this point, of research that's generally engaged with topics having to do with gender, animal rights, and animal rights activism. I conducted field work in a high intake animal shelter in the Los Angeles area. That field work culminated in a book called The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, and much of what I will be sharing with you today comes specifically from the research that I report on in more depth in that book. When I use the term high intake in the context of the United States, a high intake animal shelter is generally one, there's no firm definition, but it's generally one that has an intake of at least 15 or 20,000 animals per year. In the United States, it's heavily dogs and cats who come into animal shelters, either because they are found free roaming or stray on the street or in other settings in public, or because their guardians are unable to keep them for various reasons, and so they decide to surrender them to the shelter in the hopes that the shelter will be able to find them a new home. Animal shelters in the United States fall into 2 broad categories. Some of them have adopted what is referred to here as a no-kill philosophy. That's an approach that emphasizes that shelters should not be places where animals are killed, but rather should be places where animals have the opportunity to find new guardians. Shelters that engage in killing are shelters that, for different reasons, use the killing of animals to manage the size of the population and or the health of the population of animals who are in a particular shelter. And at the time that I conducted field work at the shelter upon which my conversation with you today is based, the shelter was receiving well over 20,000 animals a year, and about 15% of those animals each year were being killed by the shelter, primarily as a strategy of managing the size of the population, not necessarily because there wasn't adequate space for animals, but often because there wasn't adequate staff to take care of the animals who were in the shelter. I'm currently engaged in field work that focuses more on cats, and particularly on free roaming, or in the United States, they're often referred to as community cats or feral cats. I believe in Portuguese, they're referred to as gatos de rua. So cats who live in colonies and who typically are not acclimated to humans, but who often have humans who are providing care to them by giving them food and water, and sometimes also veterinary care, and often who also trap them for the purposes of sterilization. I bring to my research as a sociologist and as a gender studies scholar an intersectional perspective that is both sociological and feminist in orientation. For those of you not familiar with sociology, sociology is an academic social science discipline that's specifically interested in patterns of social behavior. So in contrast to psychology, which often focuses more on individual thinking and individual cognition and feeling, sociology focuses on how people behave and interact in the context of groups, and also specifically in very large groups, which we might refer to as institutions. And I certainly conceptualize animal shelters as a type of institution in which people from a range of different backgrounds and with sometimes competing interests come into contact with one another. In that sense, animal shelters provide us kind of a view of a microcosm of social life in the United States, because all different kinds of people come into animal shelters. It's the place where you pay for a dog license or to verify rabies certificates and provide other information that the state requires from guardians of dogs, and in some places also cats. It's some place where people come in to surrender animals or to adopt animals. So there's lots of different people moving through the animal shelter environment. Of course, also the staff and the volunteers who provide the services both to animals and to people in the shelter. In analyzing the social institutions and the social behaviors of people in the animal shelter, I also engage with a feminist animal studies approach. And feminist animal studies is a specific subfield within the broader field of critical animal studies that really considers and focuses on how power relations are exhibited and manifested in particular historical and contemporary settings, with particular attention to gender, but also very much attention to inequalities and power relations centered on race, ethnicity, disability, and ability, and also of species. What's especially important to me as a feminist animal studies scholar engaged in fieldwork in a shelter environment is that feminist approaches and feminist methods have really provided for the last 40 to 50 years the best guides for developing theoretical frameworks as well as orientations to research settings that really focus on empowering beings who one might encounter in the research process as a researcher, and empowering those beings who are typically denied power within our existing social structures in our society. So for me, feminist animal studies was particularly illuminating and important for thinking about the perspectives of dogs and cats in the shelter, rather than focusing only entirely or exclusively on the experiences and knowledge of humans who are present in the animal shelter. So my work then really draws attention to the social context in which animal sheltering takes place, and also to the human-animal relationships that develop in our society more broadly, and then how those are redefined and reenacted in the context of the animal shelter. And I really work to try to shed light on power relations within the shelter, which often are not simple. They're often quite complex, with people from different classes, race, ethnicities, gender backgrounds coming into contact and often into conflict with one another. And part of that conflict emerges as well from the fact that companion animal welfare in the United States is something of an emotionally charged issue or topic. People often feel very passionately about whether shelters should kill or should not kill animals. They often feel very passionately about how animals should live or be treated in a shelter environment. And they often are very emotional in arriving at or spending time in an animal shelter. So we have this kind of high conflict environment in which the shelter then enacts a set of bureaucratically derived policies and practices that often bring in knowledge and ideas about social inequalities from outside the shelter and cause them to reproduce or replicate inside of the shelter environment. So I want to spend a few moments talking about animal shelters, specifically as sites for policing of both animals and people. In the United States, since the inception of animal sheltering in the late part of the 1800s on the East Coast of the United States in cities like New York and Philadelphia, animal shelters have really operated based on a model referred to in the US as animal control. And the dominant idea from animal control has been to try to protect human populations from the threat of zoonotic disease that companion animals who are free roaming might pose. Animal sheltering also evolved in the late 1800s to settle disputes that people might have about who was actually the legal guardian to a particular animal, especially in cases not usually involving dogs and cats, but rather involving livestock, so cows and horses and so forth. And from its inception, the model in the United States around animal control focused very much on killing animals who were seen as undesirable or as unwanted. So in the city of New York, for example, tens of thousands of animals were drowned or clubbed to death each year in the late 1800s by animal control officers as a way to try to minimize the size of the population of animals who were in the city and who might come into contact with people, possibly spreading hygienic issues like fleas, and possibly also zoonotic diseases like sarcoptic mange or even rabies. When we look at the history of animal sheltering over time, we can see that animal shelters overall reflect a broader social view present powerfully in the United States, and I believe really in most parts of the world, that humans have a right and even a responsibility to exert human control over non-human animals, including companion animals and like cats and dogs. So we as humans make decisions about where companion animals should be, how they should live, and with whom they should live. And we feel very much as humans at liberty to make life and death decisions for companion animals as well. Even if some people are uncomfortable or unhappy with the idea that some animals who go into animal shelters are killed, our general orientation in the United States is to kill billions of animals each year for food purposes and to interfere with animal existence in a number of different ways that reflect this domination perspective that we have about animals and the natural world more broadly as well. In that kind of cultural context in which humans see themselves as superior to animals and as responsible for and dominant to animals, animals who are stray, who I believe in Portuguese are referred to often as cães ou gatos de rua or cães ou gatos sem dono, are really animals who are understood as being out of place. And here in the United States, where we have relatively few free-roaming animals, when we do see free-roaming animals, they're seen as a problematic indicator of poverty or chaos, and also, again, also as possibly physical threats, right? The physical threat, again, of disease, or the physical threat of bites or injuries. So when we see free-roaming animals in the United States, particularly, I should say, free-roaming domesticated animals in the United States, our inclination is to try to contain that because for the last 140 years or so, our animal sheltering model has developed to take these stray animals and put them into cages, right? To police them and then to jail them. And then ultimately, in many cases, historically, less so today, to kill them. There are also animals who come into the animal shelter, not because they're free roaming, but because the people who have been caring for them are no longer able to do so. They might be facing having to move. They might be having a problem around the animal with their landlord. They might be being deported because they entered the United States without documentation. They may have been arrested and are being sent to jail or to prison. They may be in a financial situation where they simply can't afford to feed or provide veterinary care for an animal. So they bring their animal to the shelter. And the people who do this in the United States are labeled as being part of a group referred to as irresponsible owners. So they are seen and understood in the United States as being people who took on responsibility for caring for a companion animal, which in the United States, we expect people to do for the duration of an animal's life, but who are no longer able to do that and therefore are surrendering their animal to the shelter. So there tends to be a great deal of stigma and negative association with people who bring animals into shelters. These are also people, logically, who tend to be economically or financially less stable. So they're disproportionately lower income people who run into problems with landlords because they don't own their own home, or who are facing deportation because they are migrants into the United States. So they tend to be the more vulnerable people in our population as well, who bring their animals into these shelters. It's much less common in communities where the population is predominantly white and or affluent to see a lot of animals coming into shelters as owner surrenders. Once animals are in the shelter itself really disciplines both animals and people. And it does that in a lot of different ways. I think one clear example or obvious example I can share with you to get you thinking about how animal shelters control animals is just to think about the organization of space in animal shelters. I've included on this slide just a small image of a Chihuahua type dog behind bars, right, in a cage. And that's one of the most common housing mechanisms that we see in animal shelters across the United States, are metal or chain link cages in which animals are kept. In shelters that have better resources and or managers with particular orientations, there might be a significant effort to get animals out of those cages every day so that they can spend time with people and or spend time with other animals. But at the shelter where I conducted field research, as is the case for a lot of the shelters here in Southern California, the resources and the investment are simply not there. And so many dogs and cats will spend the entire duration of their stay inside of the cage in which they're first placed, and they don't have the opportunity to socialize with people or with other animals. We're starting to see that change and improve, but it's certainly one example of how animals are controlled. Similarly, just to provide some examples of how the shelter disciplines people, the shelter follows a set of municipal and statewide codes and laws about how it is that people are supposed to relate to animals and what kind of care they are expected to provide. And the shelter can prevent people from adopting specific types of animals if a shelter staff member, at their discretion, feels that a particular type of person is not going, or a particular person is not going to be able to provide the care that a particular animal needs from that person. The shelter can also cite guardians of animals for failing to provide appropriate care, even when the animals are still in the home, so not even in the shelter. So officers from animal control go out into the community and they might see someone has a hole in their fence, or they might see that a dog's water bowl is empty, and they can write tickets for those kinds of deviations or offenses that can have problematic impacts, particularly for low-income people, because most commonly the punishment is that they have to pay a fine, and that fine may pose a significant hardship for many individuals. So in talking about why or how it is that animal shelters police, I want to also devote a moment to talking about why shouldn't animal shelters police animals and people. Some of what I might be talking about may or may not sound familiar to the context of animal shelters with which you are familiar in your local communities. But in the United States, the policing model has long been the central model for engaging in animal control. But what we also see is a growing body of research showing that punishment isn't effective in changing how it is that people care for animals. Writing someone a citation because they have a hole in their fence, or fining someone because they've kept their dog on a chain outside, does not lead to individuals changing that behavior. In fact, what they often do, because they have no other means of paying the fine, is to relinquish their animal to animal control in lieu of having to pay the fine. So that actually increases the number of animals coming into the shelter, and it breaks the relationship that existed between a guardian and a particular companion animal. But as is true for other types of what we might think of as criminal activity, we know that punishment doesn't effectively deter people from engaging in particular behaviors. And in fact, what we see much more overwhelmingly in the United States is that when people are given opportunities to learn about how to care differently for companion animals and are given the resources to actually enact that learning, overwhelmingly, guardians to companion animals want to do better for the animals who are in their care. Of course, there's always going to be a subset of people who dislike animals, who abuse or hurt animals. And that's a separate and fortunately quite small subpopulation. But the vast majority of people who have companion animals in their lives want to be able to provide care for them, but may not have the resources to go to a veterinarian when they see that their dog is limping, or may not have the resources. Maybe they don't have a car. It's very difficult in the Los Angeles area to even get around if you don't have a car to get to a veterinarian's office. But if they're given resources, someone who can drive them, someone who can provide them with a voucher for a veterinary visit, they very readily use those resources to increase and improve the quality of care that the animals that they're guardians to receive. Another reason to move away from the policing model of within animal shelters is that policing orientation really truly places animals' health and their lives at risk. By taking a policing orientation, that is wanting animal control to go out into the communities and to find animals and people who are out of place or who are violating the social and legal expectations for how animals should be living, results in more animals coming into the shelter. And it's in animal shelters that animals are exposed to large numbers of other animals and where they tend to also experience high levels of stress that appears to depress their immune function. That means that in shelters like the one where I conducted field work for 3 years, there's almost the constant circulation of upper respiratory infections, also referred to as kennel cough, as well as other contagious diseases, some of which some of the residents of the shelter may not yet have been vaccinated against, like distemper, which is almost always fatal. So bringing more animals into the shelter means that those animals are at greater risk of contracting diseases from other animals in the shelter. And then, of course, in shelters, also like the shelter where I conducted field work, where the practice is to kill animals, animals' lives are actually at risk, both because they could get so sick that they might die or be humanely euthanized because of an illness they contracted in the shelter, but also because the shelter may decide that a particular animal is taking too long to be adopted or is not likely to be adopted, or the staff think it's unfriendly or whatever it might be, and the animal is killed at the shelter. The policing orientation really contributes to and supports the practice of killing animals. And finally, I would note that the policing orientation increases animal and human suffering. I think I've already explained some of the ways in which animals suffer from coming into shelter environments in which they're constrained in cages, often denied appropriate enrichment and contact with humans and other animals. Sorry, my cat has just jumped onto my lap with a loud purr, so I was momentarily distracted. And so animals, as I was also mentioning, experience health risks, but humans also suffer when their relationships with their companion animals are broken. What I consistently observed in my research among people who were surrendering their animals to animal shelters were people who were weeping, people who were deeply emotionally distressed about having to surrender their animals, people who had tried all manner of alternatives to bringing their animals to the shelter, reaching out to relatives, to coworkers, to neighbors, to try to find someone else who could care for their animal for them, and really coming to the shelter as a last resort in the hopes that their animal might have an opportunity for a better life, but where for them, the breaking of that bond really just becomes another component of the violence of poverty that they are often already experiencing in so many other ways. Losing their animal is just another site of injury for them, and one that is often particularly raw and painful. Turning to talk a bit more about social inequalities in the context of animal sheltering, I want to spend a few moments talking about the United States context and how in the United States certain types of animals have become associated over time through media representation, but also through broader cultural narratives with members of specific human groups. And I'll talk specifically about pit bulls, who are the subject on their own of one chapter in my book. Pit bulls constitute, among dogs, the largest category of dog that come into shelters in the United States. And they're animals who are often viewed as being unwanted, unlikable, and undesirable. And that set of beliefs around pit bulls stems in significant part from a broader cultural belief in the United States that pit bulls are dogs who belong with and belong to low-income men of color, especially Black and Latino men in the United States. And we see this replicated particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, when pit bulls became sort of a source of media fascination, routinely being shown in a negative light and in the company of Black and Latino men in the United States. And how these dogs are perceived not just as problematic in their own right, but as sharing certain characteristics even with the men who are presumed to be their owners and are presumed to be the only appropriate people to be their owners, has shaped how the shelter system itself treats those animals, as well as those types of people, that is Black and Latino men, when they actually come into the shelter. So, for example, which kinds of communities actually experience high levels of policing in the United States varies based on the racial composition of a neighborhood and the affluence of a neighborhood. So just as we see so-called over-policing, that is a higher rate of police presence in low-income communities in the United States and communities where Black and Indigenous and Latin people are more likely to be living, we also see that animal control is more likely to be active in those particular communities. So that means that someone who's engaging in perhaps a relatively minor violation, like maybe they haven't paid for a license for a dog that they recently got, is more likely to receive a fine, so to be caught in the first place and then to be fined for having that dog, than someone who lives in a more affluent or white community, where typically there is no animal control presence out in the community at all. So I, for example, live in a neighborhood which predominantly is occupied by white and Asian American people of middle and upper middle class standing. We have a nonprofit humane society that handles animal sheltering in our community. And in the more than 10 years that I've lived in this community, I've never seen an animal control officer from that shelter out in the neighborhood looking for dogs who don't have licenses, or looking for holes in fences, or looking for other kinds of issues. In contrast, at the shelter where I conducted my field work, which is only about 15 minutes drive away from where I live, but which is located in a predominantly Latin community and also poor Asian American community, where more people are renting their homes, where the majority of the population does not speak English as their first language, where the majority of the population are immigrants, and where the majority of the population are living at or near the poverty line, animal control officers spend a significant part of their routine tasks out in the community, specifically looking for violations like unlicensed animals, dogs or cats who are stray or loose, and other types of potential violations. So that means in those communities, people are much more likely to have an encounter with animal control. They're more likely to have their animals be policed by animal control and have themselves be policed as well. The ideas that that staff and volunteers and the policymakers more broadly within the shelter system also create also means that how veterinary and behavioral staff treat and respond to animals reflects ideas and values about which animals are deserving animals and which animals belong to problematic or so-called problematic populations outside of the shelter. So turning back to pit bulls again, pit bulls have they have the highest euthanasia rate among dogs who come into the shelter system, in part because they're there in large numbers, but they're there in large numbers in part because they're being significantly over-policed outside of the shelter. And once they're inside of the shelter, they're subjected to a different set of rules and expectations for their behavior. There is a higher set of requirements that people who want to adopt them have to meet in order to be able to adopt them and take them out of the shelter, because the shelter continues to construct and view them as being like the Black and Latino men who they are assumed to cohabit with, namely dangerous and potentially violent. So these animals, these pit bulls, are not likely to be heavily promoted for adoption, and they are the most likely, as I said, to be killed in the animal shelter, both from illness. So they die often from illnesses that they contract there, but then they're not selected for the investment of treatment, and they are killed as a strategy of population management as well. And then finally, I would also note that one important function that the animal sheltering system serves is really as a safety net for animals, or some way. I don't even want to use the term safety net because it's not a safety net the way it's currently operating, but sort of as a catch pan for managing the population of animals who are displaced because of the housing market system that we have in the United States, in which landlords are relatively free to set restrictions on the types of animals who may, or if any animals at all, may live in properties that they are renting, and where in the Los Angeles area people face very high rental costs and very, very high costs to try to purchase homes, which means that there's a lot of housing instability. And so from a class-based perspective, the shelter is also serving as a way to try to generate some kind of revenue, like through adoption fees, through grants, to make some kind of money out of a population of animals that's otherwise really a discarded part of the capitalist economy. They're really the animals who are understood and constructed as being in the excess of what capitalism is able to support, but the sheltering system and the way that the entire sheltering industry has developed in the United States succeeds in extracting profit from this population of animals as well. And that's something that we generally see in capitalist societies, is that capitalism finds a way to extract resources, to extract money, even from those populations where it seems like no money could possibly be extracted, like people in prison or dogs in animal shelters. So to conclude this conversation, I just want to share with you a few steps that veterinarians can think about taking to challenge inequalities that you might encounter in your own work with companion animals. And this might be work that you're undertaking in animal sheltering environments, or perhaps in outreach groups trying to work with populations of street dogs or street cats in Brazil. There's lots of different places and areas in which you might have an opportunity to be a thought leader, or to be someone who's taking action around improving the conditions for people and animals, and to reducing social inequalities in the society more broadly by disrupting where they reproduce in one routine site, namely in animal sheltering and in companion animal welfare politics more generally. So I think one good starting place simply is to check in with your own biases, irrespective of what your own personal background is. There's a very good chance that you have your own ideas about what an appropriate or proper life is for a cat or for a dog or for other types of animals. And I think it's really worthwhile to explore where and how it is that you developed those particular ideas, and what other alternative ways of caring for animals you might also consider acceptable. In the United States today, most people believe that companion dogs and cats should be kept primarily or even exclusively for cats indoors. that they should be fed and provided veterinary care, that they should have toys and beds, and that they should cuddle and engage in a lot of social activity with the people who care for them. But if you have spent time observing dogs living in other situations, you may also have observed that there are many other environments and contexts in which dogs and cats can live content and happy lives, particularly if they're provided with the basic resources that those animals need to be safe and secure. That is to say that street dogs and street cats may be able to have healthy and long lives if they're protected from traffic and protected from humans who might want to do them harm, maybe because they view them as nuisances or for other reasons. And if they have the opportunity to have regular access to fresh food and water, and if they're provided with routine vaccinations, and if they're sterilized so that their population doesn't exceed what the local environment or space can support. In checking in with some of your own assumptions and biases, I think also helps individuals shift in your thinking about the type of care you provide to animals and people so that you can do so, maybe not without any judgment, but certainly with less judgment, so that you can think about how someone who might be struggling to care for an animal is still trying to do their best, and that perhaps if there are resources made available to them, which could also include resources through mutual aid, that they may have a good opportunity of maintaining a meaningful relationship with an animal or a group of animals. In the United States, there's been a longstanding assumption that animal shelters are better for animals than being on the street, that is, than being stray. And that's something that current research is really throwing into question, at least here in the United States. Our population of stray and free-roaming animals in the United States is a fraction of that in Brazil. So I realize there are going to be some contextual differences here, and I think those are important for you to think about. I unfortunately have not yet had the opportunity to visit Brazil. I would love to, so I'm going to leave it to your expertise to think about the living situations in which animals could potentially be successful without them having to move into the caged environment of animal shelters, where they're also potentially at risk for disease. And my understanding is that many Brazilian animal shelters also use shelter killing as a tool of management. So just rethinking where animals are really best off and whether shelters are necessarily the best place for animals who are stray, or even for animals who might be experiencing some forms, not all, but some forms of neglect in the home in which they are living. I certainly also encourage you as veterinarians to advocate for, develop yourselves, and participate in programs that work to help maintain human-animal bonds. We consistently see in research the benefit of companion animal contact for children and for adults. It has positive psychological benefits, positive physical health benefits, and I think enriches the life worlds of humans and animals alike when we have multi-species or interspecies contact. So thinking about some of the ways in which you as a veterinarian can be an advocate for expanding human-animal bonds and creating situations in which people can develop different types of relationships as well with animals. In the United States, we have a very powerful ownership model, the idea that you adopt or buy an animal and that animal then belongs to you and you have control over the animal. We tend to couch that relationship as an animal being a family member, but it's a family member who never develops or never grows up or has autonomy. But in my research with, for example, women, mostly women who take care of feral cats or gatos de rua, I find that these women, even though they can't touch the cats, have very meaningful relationships and connections with those cats. So there may be other ways to promote human-animal bonds that aren't simply about bringing animals into human spaces and into human life worlds, but also ways in which humans can be of service to animals in the environments in which they are already living, and also there have the opportunity to develop socially recognized, meaningful relationships. And then finally, I encourage you to think creatively about how to improve the life chances of companion animals. What are things that you can do as a veterinarian and someone with specialized and important knowledge to advance the interests of companion animals? How can you think about companion animals as having interests of their own? What is it that companion animals actually hope for? What are their aspirations? And why do we always sideline what we think their aspirations might be? On the rare occasion we even bother to think about them in our conversations about companion animal welfare. I think there are a lot of different ways to engage in mutual aid projects, to engage in providing animal care and service to animal populations that otherwise are being overlooked or neglected in communities. And whether that means you're able to donate some of your time, or you found your own charity, or you simply use your veterinary knowledge to help educate people about treatments that would benefit a community of animals. I have no doubt that you have a world of creative opportunity to think about how you can improve the life chances of companion animals, and in doing so, likely also improve the lives of people, particularly the lower income people who are most likely to be living with and among vulnerable animals as well. So it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. On the following slide, I'm just including again my email address. You're very welcome to contact me if you have any questions that I can help further answer. And I wish you all the best in your educational training.